Jens, it's absolutely great to be back in Örebro chatting with you again about all things metal and all things in the world of heaviness. Starting off on the subject of heaviness, I know it's a really challenging question, but how would you define heaviness as part of metal music?
Yeah, I think that is a really interesting question because to me heaviness can be so many things. It's like sometimes I hear people refer to heaviness as it could be something that's more brutal maybe, but technically if you start to think about the term, is that really heaviness? Personally, I think heaviness doesn't necessarily have to be about sound at all. I guess you can emphasize heaviness with help of sound. For example, people come to me because they usually want their instruments to come through better or be defined. I don't think that necessarily makes it more heavy, but that's all about the perception. If you ask people when it comes to heavy music, what is heavy? Some would go like refer to like old albums, Black Sabbath or Slayer or whatever, while a different generation maybe or different people would say that Dimmu Borgir, that's super heavy. So I think that's a lot about perception. And if you ask me personally, I guess when I think about heavy, it's more a musical expression. I guess it's some sort of sense of heft and slowness to it maybe, but not necessarily, I guess. I also find it really interesting how usually heavy is always described as something positive. For almost everyone at least. Usually when you see a band talking about the new album, it's always heavier than the previous one. The only exception actually is a band called Dragon Force that I've seen making exact that comment, that everyone is always saying that it's more heavy, but no, our new album is less heavy and it's happier. Like that would be a thing. But most of the time I think if you're into heavy metal music, heavier is always better. At least in terms of when you want to describe something. Then if that's actually the case, I guess that's down to the listener.
And briefly yesterday we were talking about heaviness in other genres. You feel that other genres have got that quality as well?
Yeah, of course. I mean, if you think about it, heaviness comes down to the musical expression. You find that in classical music, for example. If you draw a direct comparison, you could sort of see the metal band as having references in the orchestra in terms of double bass, cello, anything that you could play the strings in a distorted way. The low brass, for example, that's like as close to distorted guitars as you could come, basically. And you could definitely do heavy metal songs very, very nicely just using an orchestra, and it will feel just as heavy, maybe even heavier, because it's an orchestra by design over the centuries have been created to sound as good as possible, right, on its own. And believe me, if you put a pair of microphones in a rehearsal room with a metal band, it doesn't really sound that refined. But I think you can find heaviness in just about anything. I've listened to heavy country music, listened to 16 horsepower, for example. Maybe that's not your standard Dolly Parton kind of country music, but still you could find using only folk instrument, as long as the musical expression is there, it can be really heavy. And hip-hop is another great example when you won't find any type of distortion or anything that usually would be associated with heaviness. And it can be really freaking heavy.
And from that perspective of distortion and heaviness in metal music, do you think that a band could have clean guitars, no distortion, and still be considered as part of the metal genre?
Oh, that's a good question. I guess since we really like to box things, you know, and place them in different categories, you might have an issue if you don't have any distorted things. But on the other hand, there are some examples, none that I could pull. But if you have some element, let's say that you're driving distorted bass and just using clean guitars and some sort of vocal expression that is sort of inspired by the metal scene, I'm pretty sure that you could find a good acceptance in the metal community for that. But then it's down to whatever people will brand you with, right? It would be an interesting experiment, though, to go out, market yourself as a metal band without, like, and the whole idea being that you try to avoid anything that is metal, but still market yourself as metal and see if you sort of get away with it. That would be the empirical study
That would be
on that matter.
That's our next research project. There we go. Yeah, fantastic. From a mix perspective, from a metal music mix perspective, what are the foundational components that deliver the perception of heaviness to the listener?
I personally think that the production has way less to perception of heaviness than people might give it credit for. My perspective is that you could get a heavy song, you know, a heavily written song, and you could shape it in 100 different ways and it could still be as heavy, or going this way could be perceived more heavy by some people, going this way could be perceived more heavy by others. For example, when you produce metal, you can go like really specific and do a lot of editing. We refer to it as Pro Tools metal in a way, you know, when you quantize everything and everything is to the point, everything is exactly in tune, in time. And some would say that, yeah, now it sounds really heavy, or now everything comes together and the tightness of things, it's a part of the heaviness. And in one way, I guess they're right, there are many bands that succeeded that way. I could argue that they would probably have succeeded in many other ways as well. For example, if they would have chosen a more natural production path with maybe even some sort of dogma by not quantize everything or not add support samples, or in a way maybe that would be perceived as even heavier. But what I'm trying to say here is that when it comes to development of sound in this genre, I don't think the productions has so much importance. I think, for example, when people refer to some of the really heavy early stuff, for example, Entombed, and people got crazy about wanting to sound like Entombed, but that's the compositions, you know. It's one of the first bands that came around that had a tune the guitars into B, and you know, just play one open B and it sounds super heavy, and people had not really heard that before. And then everyone wanted to have that guitar sound, but that guitar sound could have been anything of it would just by accident it happened in a certain way, more or less. And that's another interesting thing, like people come to me because they have heard something I did that was a pure result of me working with that band and those compositions, that doesn't necessarily apply to what this band is doing. And it probably shouldn't, because if they want to sound like this band, I would say that's probably not a smart thing. You probably want to search for your own sound instead and try to be an inspiration for other bands rather than just sounding like something else.
From this perspective of it being about the composition and about the performance, and you're touching on the sort of subject of authenticity of Pro Tools metal, as you refer to it, and that it being that Heaviness is less about the sound. What are your reflections on lo-fi, low fidelity metal productions, the sort of Scandinavian metal that was not produced to what most people would think is clear or particularly heavy, perhaps more to do with atmosphere? What are your reflections on how listeners might perceive heaviness within a lo-fi compared to a high fidelity production?
If we should talk about some early 90s kind of productions like Norwegian black metal or Swedish death metal, I guess you cannot really refer to them as pristine sounding. But I think that was the only way to get those albums together. I think that if someone would send one of these albums to me for a remix, for example, you would start noticing things that, doesn't really make sense playing wise. And if you start to make all of that be clear, it would probably sound less heavy in a way, because then you feel like, oh, that's sloppy and that's weird. In a way, when you just mold things in, distort it, create weird new overtones by distorting everything, and then putting as much effects and delay on the vocals, you actually get multiple performances in one. All that adds to a certain emotion, right? I'm not sure if this is heaviness. It's brutal. Is it heavy? Yeah, maybe it's heavy. If people perceive it heavy, then I guess it's heavy.
And picking up on that theme of the Norwegian and Swedish death metal scene and Norwegian black metal and the low fidelity, we've now sort of transitioned from the earlier performances of Black Sabbath more towards much faster performances. What are your thoughts on the way that the space that's available within these performances informs the production?
I think that technology has probably affected the actual sound more than the musical style, maybe. But then the musical styles have developed as technology has developed, in a way that people realize that, oh, we can do this super fast, super complex stuff because now it's actually possible to do that. And that has built on each other. I know bands that, never would be able to play the songs. They sort of have to spend half a year learning the songs after the studio session. So that has affected, technology has definitely had an impact on actual songwriting that way. I think that if technology would not have developed that way, you were still recording onto tape, for example, you would probably still try to make really fast and complex album, but I guess we would never have reached this level of, how should I put it, pristine and detailed productions that we have today. But I don't necessarily think that's a good thing. Maybe it would have been more interesting to listen to a lot of the modern albums in a format where you actually had to record them in a linear fashion, I suppose. And yeah, but I also think all of this, for me at least, it also tells me how little the production actually means compared to how important the song is, the expression, the performance, even the lyrics, even though in metal maybe the lyrics arguably are a little bit less important than in many other genres. But yeah, luckily people don't realize this because they still want to come to me, for example, and think that it's really important with productions.
Picking up on that theme of it being less to do with the sound than a lot of people think that it's about the composition and about the performance, moving towards the way you capture these sounds and deliver them in recorded form, What do you feel are the main challenges to producing and mixing metal music that are different than other genres?
Could I just fill in one more thing there?
Yeah.
I think it's also important to say that. So when I say that the production is probably much less important than most people think, I should also say that there is a discrepancy here between the end listener, the non-musician, and the musicians. Because metal is also a community of a lot of musicians that are record buyers and consumers of other bands, and those people tend to think that it's more important with the production quality, right? For example, I know people that could listen to an album solely because of the snare sound, more or less, or if there's a really good bass player, for example, that has this sound that could really bring forth that band, you know. But that's more important for the musicians. When it comes to the little broader mass, I know that it's not so important to those people, at least. But the metal, I would say this, without having the scientific data, I would assume that there are more musicians in the metal scene than any other genre, maybe except jazz and, you know, classical music maybe. But
yeah, that's an interesting. Yeah, the community of metal musicians and the way that they will listen to music very different than you know, it's always that thing whether will a 14-year-old metal fan in Portugal tell the difference, you know, all of that. Yeah. But the idea of the challenges of metal music production that aren't there or far less there for other genres, what do you feel they are?
Yeah, so I think there are no other genre on the planet that I know of that sound as bad in its raw form as metal music. Like if you put these two mics in a space, the orchestra would be the best example of something that just sounds good. You know, it's like orchestrated and selected and conducted to sound good on its own. If you have a singer-songwriter, it's a little bit the same thing, you know, it sounds good. And the more stuff you add, the pop band can still sound pretty good on a stage, or at least an unplugged version of it. Same with maybe a country band or something. But as soon as you start to electrify things and you start to distort things and then you start to play a little faster than you might be able to, and go into a rehearsal space of a metal band, and it sounds absolutely terrible because they have not been trained into making their performance sound as the end result. They're only interested in playing their riffs. The drummer is only interested in, you know, nailing the things, not necessarily thinking about how loud should I play on that cymbal. How do I need to play on this tom? How do I need to tune this tom? How do I need to make it sound? It's like the whole metal scene, especially today, is something else than what you have in the rehearsal room. And that's also a little bit unique, in an extreme way unique for metal bands. I guess most metal bands have an idea about their sound that is very different from how they are actually sounding, you know. And that's based off albums they've heard and some sort of image in their head. There are exceptions. Some bands are very dogmatic in terms of the organic sense, and they want it to sound like, yeah, this should sound like when we play live or something, and I guess that's fine. But usually people think about their sounds, maybe especially when it comes to the drums, that is very different to what you have. So they basically come with their drums, and then it's up for the producer to sort of completely destroy that into something different. So that's a big challenge, and that's also why I think in the metal scenes, producers, you sort of choose your producer based off the sound you want, which is a weird concept to me, because the producer historically is so much more than a sound man. Usually you would, in my perspective, you would sort of choose the engineer, the mixer, and then the producer based off completely different things. But since bands most of the time doesn't even know what a producer do in music, they think it's about the sound, which it, you know, very well can be, but usually there is so much more to it. So that's interesting. People usually come to me for the sound, but they don't always realize that I have this other palette of things that I would actually help them to do, and that also affects the sound. You know, the way the vocals are arranged, the way various things are done, right? But for the actual sound, I guess the mixing is usually the most important thing, and hopefully the recording and engineering part has sort of been done in a way of how we can get from this poorly sounding rehearsal band into something they want.
So we've chatted about heaviness in the metal music genre and heaviness in other music genres, but when it comes to recording and specifically mixing metal music, what do you feel are the challenges specific to the metal music genre that aren't there with these other genres?
The big challenge, the biggest technical challenge is space, and that is dictated by rhythm guitars, and that's one of these things that you don't have in any other genre. And that's pretty interesting, because I've been doing this for almost 30 years now, and I started out working with all kinds of different genres. So I have some sort of ability, I guess, with whatever song, whatever style it would be, and it's so easy every time you get something in that doesn't have distorted guitars. It could also be, for example, if I'm doing like an orchestral version of an album or something, it's just all this space, you know, the sound feel, everything is open, and you can like actually dial things in, and everything works. Whilst the typical metal song, you could work on the drums, you know, you have a nicely recorded drum kit in a room, and you listen to the room mics, oh, that's nice. And then you listen to the snare, pretty good, let's add some treble, and oh, this is so nice. And then you add the distorted guitars that are by design filling up the whole frequency space like this, completely compressed from the tubes distorting, and everything is gone. It's like those drums that sounded so natural, so vivid and roomy, just sound like popcorn in there. It's like completely gone. So that's when you have to start making the compromises, if you wish, or you have to work and try to defeat those guitars in a way. And at the same time, the guitars is such an important element in at least 95% of metal, right? In terms of the riffs and everything. And at the same time, all the details in the drums is equally important. So you have to start to make these compromises and start to maybe compress harder than you would actually think you want, especially when you solo listen things. Yeah, basically start to create more even, more focused harmonics to be able to help it cut through those guitars. And you have to start compromising everywhere. I would say a metal mix is one big compromise in order to make it work. But and the most important things, I guess that goes with all mixing, but especially here, is that if you start to isolate things too much, it's not gonna work. You would have to like always have those guitars in there, or you will be lost in terms of, yeah, you could work 5 hours on creating a drum sound, add the guitars, and everything is gone. So that's like my standard thing. When I start mixing, I always start with the guitars. At least to some extent, even though maybe I build the mix from the percussive side. If I don't have the guitars in there already, I'm gonna be lost. So that is the big challenge, like the lack of space. If I would sum it up, that's the big challenge when mixing metal.
And continuing from that theme, that challenge that you've got, if you had a band or the band's record label that came to you and they asked you to make a production heavier, of course it would depend on the project in question, but what would your initial thoughts be about making it heavier?
Yeah, I think the first thing would be to ask, to make sure that I understand what they mean with heavy, right? Because most of the time, if that would come from a label, that kind of question, I think they just wanted to sound better. So the first thing I would do is like then go back to the previous stuff and listen. Why is this not heavy, and why is heaviness the goal? Like, is there something here? Maybe it's just about overall production quality rather than anything else, you know. That and they don't really know how to describe it, so they use the word heavy because heavy is always good. Remember, but no, but I would say that I would probably not do anything really different. Maybe it's also about selecting the songs. When I work with some bands, for example, Amorphis being a good example, they always come with a big batch of songs, and there are multiple songwriters, so they give me the trust of actually selecting the songs for the album, which is a big responsibility that I gladly take on. And if I feel that, okay, so these are the best songs maybe, out of the 30 that I got, we have 12 songs here that we maybe should work on, then I would say that if the band want to go heavier, it's here, it happens. Like, let's select the heaviest songs then. I don't think anyone would really refer to actual sound or whatever, because the sound will happen based off what fits the songs. So that's the important thing.
That makes sense. Reflecting on, continuing from albums you've produced, such as Queen of Time, and albums you've produced, but also albums that have been influential to you. What are the albums that you look back on and you're very proud of from how they represent the songs, the performances, this idea of heaviness, and albums that have been influential to you throughout your 30-year history in producing metal music?
When it comes to albums that have influenced me in terms of, well, anything, I suppose, well, sound or sense of heavy, because heavy is always good. Yeah. Right? I think that for me it's been a little bit different than maybe most other metal producers that I know, because most other metal producers are a result of or a product of the genre itself in a way. Usually by being active in some metal band, and then they started to become interested in the production scene. I did not come from the metal genre at all. Well, maybe a little bit, but I was more into other genres, more like post-punk and stuff like that, and a lot of the 70s prog stuff as well was something that I listened to a lot when I was practicing guitar and stuff back in the old days. So my inspiration has usually not been from the classical albums. I didn't even know these when I started out, you know. The first time I worked with growl, I didn't like it. It was like, what is this? But I had a pretty decent knowledge in terms of overall engineering, in a way that maybe many metal producers, they come from a little different perspective and learn the craft more specific to metal, whilst I had done, you know, jazz and pop and classical stuff and had a different approach a little bit to most other metal producers, I should say. And that was in a way hard for me, because I had to, when I started to work with metal bands, I started to enjoy it, and apparently I was pretty good at it, because more came, and suddenly I had only metal bands at my doorstep. So I had to get into the genre a little bit more, and people were referring to these Entombed albums and stuff. I had no idea, never heard, you know. And I thought, it was like, this sounds shit. So I guess from the get-go I've had a little bit more unique approach in a way, because I haven't been biased or influenced by all these the same albums as everyone else. So my ideal of sound was different, and maybe more hi-fi than most other metal listeners or metal producers. That's also one thing that I have really noticed when I say that the production is not so important compared to the compositions and the songs, the performances. My own scientific results here are purely based on albums that I've done. That are the albums that I've done that reached the most people and were the best songs and the best performances are the ones that become the most popular, and the ones that helped me the most to getting new clients in. And that just happened to be those, because they become the most popular. I have done other albums that I personally think sounds better, but that few people knew about, and thus they did not become influential. And I guess in a way, on some of those albums, I've become a little bit lucky, because I was working with some good bands. Opeth, for example, has been like my most important band in terms of they got really big with two of the albums that I did for them. The Ghost Reveries and the Watershed albums. And they signed with Roadrunner and started to sell loads of albums. And they would have done that no matter who produced them, or no matter how it would sound. In a way, sure, we spent a lot of time doing our absolute best on those albums. We wanted to show the Americans that we could, you know, do something really great. And speaking of which, on those albums, I was completely unknown in the metal scene, more or less, at that point. And the American label wanted some, you know, known mixer to do it, but the band really insisted that I should do it. And I got lucky in that way to actually be able to do something that was also unique in that way, because it did not sound like other metal albums that were big at the time. And that was something that was really important for me, to get that platform to be able to show what I could do to a broader audience. If I wouldn't have done Opeth, I would probably still be doing local bands or something.
We've chatted about the challenges of metal music production, the space that the guitars take up. What do you feel are the sort of trade-offs and limitations with your processing approach is when mixing a metal album? In other words, with increased drum cohesion, there's the potential for reduced clarity, and with thicker, denser guitar tones, they sort of mask the other instruments. What are you trying to do, and what are the sort of trade-offs, if you know what I mean, that if you make the guitars thinner, it allows the bass to come through, and if you make the bass more in the lows, it sounds this, but it compromises that. What are those trade-offs that you're sort of navigating when you're mixing an album?
The biggest challenges from a mixing and arrangement perspective, especially if I get an album in for mixing that I haven't been able to produce myself. Because if you produce yourself, you can think about these things a little bit, how it's gonna work down the line. You know, let's not put this viola in this range because it's gonna be a problem. Let's find something else instead, and that way you have arranged the song in a way that will work in the mix. But if you get an arrangement that is made, maybe produced by the band or something, then you just have to sort of do the best you can out of it, right? And I would say that for most metal, and how it mostly differs from more like rock, because rock also has distorted guitars, but usually they won't have as fast and intense drumming. Usually they have a drum pace and a playing that sounds good on its own. Whilst in metal, usually you would have fast passages where the snare sounds, doesn't sound good. And the kick drums are so fast, so you either take the whole low end if you want a full rich kick, or you make them really thin so there's more place for the guitars, and maybe there's this important pole muting riff going at the same time that is more important than the kick drums, and then you would have to like constantly compromise and find ways and also automate through the mix. Like on this section I need the kicks to be thinner because I really need that bass line to come through. On this section it's slow, it's like half time, the space. Okay, the kick sounds like a joke when they come from the previous part, then I need to rework the kick drums into being longer, have more space, and at the same time make that transition sound natural so it doesn't sound like it's a new drummer coming in. So those are challenges that every time I get something more like rocky in, more standard drumming, a standard, little less distortion on the guitars, it's so easy. You can work with compression with the drums in a way that they engage rhythmically with the drums, whilst in metal, it's like playing like this, and double kicks, like if I put parallel compression on, it just dims. And then you would have to find different ways, like, okay, so I would need to leave out the kick drums from my drum bus, and then it doesn't respond to the kick anymore. It sounds a little boring. Maybe I would have to sort of like create some sort of key pointers so that I could get that motion into the drums again. It's all these compromises is the big thing here. It's like there's so much of it in metal mixing into making it sound natural, but it's actually like one big result of a lot of efforts into finding the ideal mix for each section in a way that I haven't really found in other genres.
Fantastic. And we've talked about the importance and the space of these harmonically distorted electric guitars. Although I'm sure it differs from project to project, but do you have any broad principles with saturation and distortion and tape emulation that you will often use at the mix with other instruments, overdrive, distortion on vocals or bass, and saturation principles that means that they're maybe more cohesive with the guitars or got that additional frequency content?
Yeah. I would say that in order to create, in a way, different spaces for each element in the mix, I do use a lot of distortion on other things. Again, to be able to, enhance overtones, harmonics, and to be able to fight those guitars a little bit, so to speak. And I do that by trying to also vary things, that I never use the same distortion on, for example, if I help the drums with some distortion, maybe with tape emulators or whatever, I try to avoid using the same things on vocals, for example, or I might have some harmonic content generator based on my key bus. Or keys and effects. That's usually something different than I use for my lead guitars, for example, for that very reason, to make it more easy to mix them together. And that goes with everything. It's same with guitars. If I have 4 rhythm guitars, for example, I always try to have 3 and 4 in some sort of different cabinet or different amp, usually on the cabinet side at least, or a completely different setup, because they will blend much better together. Same with the solos and lead guitars. It's never the same setup as the rhythm guitars because they just won't mix together, which is weird. You might think that they would mix very nicely together if it's the same sound, but for some reason, psychoacoustically, that doesn't work. But as soon as you change the cab, change the microphone, do something that is like fundamentally different, then it mixes itself. So when I produce an album and I record all these things, that's how I think as well. If I have something that's going on there, let's say it's a guitar, lead guitar, and then that lead guitar is played with an octave, and I try to change something for the octave performance. Just don't have one setup that I do everything with, because that's gonna create issues for me in the mix. Same if I produce vocals, I usually cut backing vocals with a different microphone than the lead vocals. Again, it's like mixes itself. It's so easy to get it in. Whilst if you have the same microphone, the same chain, it's like, oh, it's harder to get the harmony vocals in there together with the lead vocals. So in a perfect world, if I can do everything from the production side, I have, like, sound-wise, I have the idea from the very start to the end, how things are gonna blend together and what kind of methods and tricks I can do along the way to make them fit in together, which is, yeah, things that people usually don't think about too much, I guess.
And along the way, those tricks that you use to make things work together, does your approach with parallel compression and or room mics change a lot project to project, or do you have a preferred route that you tend to find works for your mixing?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I really wish that it was possible to have a template that I could use every time, but it's so complex. Maybe that would be a little easier if I would always be recording myself. Then I guess I would sort of fall into this trap of doing things the same way. But since I also work with so much different stuff, you know, the whole world has changed in people's ability to record on their own, and album budgets are usually much smaller these days because people don't sell as much albums, and that way I get, you know, all kinds of things in. So what works on one product needs a completely different approach on the next one. But that said, of course there are always some sort of ideas that I have, or at least starting points that I think that, yeah, I'm probably going to work like this. But it all come down to the material. Like on this album, the drums has the potential of sounding organic because it's a really good recorded, it's really good, well played. Then I'm going to absolutely go for that. That's my, like, baseline, as organic as the material can handle, kind of thing. Which is no absolute truth, but in my opinion. And then I might get feedback, like, we want it to sound a little bit more organic. It's like, okay. Then we'll also sound a little less clear, probably, a little bit more rough in the edges, but that's probably fine. And then I would try that. If they then say that, well, actually, we want it to be a little clearer. It's like, okay, but you also told me about the organic thing, and here's the thing. And then you would have to find some sort of middle ground, maybe, or go back, or whatever. Or it could be the opposite. Like, I think that the drums were super well recorded. I have created this wonderful organic mix. And the band would say, actually, we want to sound more powerful. You know, they're Germans usually. Then I would say that, okay, shame, but I can do that. And that way I have to adapt. And that's another thing. I might have my ideas about things, and people come to me, and usually they like what I do because they know what to expect, sort of. But bands are so different, you know, taste is so different. Like we talked about before, how Heaviness can be perceived in so different ways. The same goes with the taste and style. I could work with one band that just calls for more. We want more reverb on the snare, more. The lead guitarist needs to sing, more delay. It's like, but this is getting really mushed up. But like from a technical perspective, it starts to sound like shit. And but you sort of have to go that way because in the end, it's their album. I'm never gonna listen to it again. And then you come in with the next band, And then you sort of maybe have that mindset a little bit. It's like, yeah, delay on the guitars, I suppose. And then it's like, oh no, I can't hear my notes. It needs to be really dry solo. It's like, okay, all right, let's get into that mindset. And then you do the next band, and they want super detailed kick drums. And then the next band is like, yeah, we want a bit more of a rock thing. It's like this constant thing of adapting. Which I think is fun, you know, because I try not to have too strict ideas and preferences myself, because in the end it's the artist's music. It's not my music. I'm just there to help and support and try to make the best out of it. If you get too full of yourself and as a producer or as a mixer and want to place everyone into your grid or your slot, then I think the history might judge you.
I very much agree. And from that perspective of adapting and adopting different approaches for each band, and this idea of, you know, drummers wanting different qualities, do you tend to change with every band as to whether you use drum samples taken from the kit used for tracking or your own drum samples that you've created? And in each instance, do you tend to go with drier samples or more ambient samples, or again, is it just dependent on the project?
It is completely depending on the project, but I guess over time I have created a pretty big sample library from my own productions and other things, and then I always go the extra mile and do the hard work when I start to mix the first song to actually, you know, try things out, because that's another very important thing when it comes to mixing. I don't know if that's extra important when it comes to these sort of dense mixing. It probably is. I always try to scientifically approach the mixing, knowing that I have selected what works the best. Not just try something that works, go for that. But actually also, this works, let's try something else, see, and then compare. Well, actually, this sounded better, or, nah, the first one was better. Or I could do several things, especially when it comes to really important parts of the mix, like the snare drum, for example, the vocal sound. I can usually create a sound, like, pretty quickly, forget about it, get rid of it, and redo it from the top. Little different method maybe, or just by doing it again, it will become different. And then I can compare, okay, this became better, throw the other one away, move forward. Same with guitars, for example. Because the brain adapts, you know, the brain is your biggest enemy when you mix. It's like constantly adapting to what it hears. And you may think that your guitar sound is great, and then you come back the next day and it's like, oh, actually. I think by trying to work pretty fast and create a sound, and then just forget about it a little bit, create a new sound, try that, new amp, a little different mic placement maybe, and then I could then have like 4 or 5 things, especially if we're like producing an album. I could spend a full day together with the guitar players to try to iron out the best possible guitar sound. And the only way to do that is working scientifically, instead of like slowly working up against one result. You create multiple results that I then can compare with, and then we can sort of make a little bit of a rough mix of the drums maybe and see this guitar sound has everything that we like in terms of heaviness and like pleasing frequency response, aggression, all these adjectives that you want a good metal sound to have, right? That it's supposed to enhance the delivery or the emotions that the music should bring. Because in the end, that's what we are doing, right? We're not selling a sound, we're not selling a production, we're selling emotions. And that's what it's about. And I think that that's also important to remember when you mix and produce and create sounds, that the best sound is not always the best sound, if you know what I mean.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Jens. Are we okay to have a look at the mix processing approach you've gone through for this mix?
Of course.
Thank you.
Soilwork.